Hello, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk About Shh. This podcast aims to help you navigate your relationships, maximize your pleasure, and get the most out of your sex life. Every week, we cover a different topic related to the full spectrum of sexuality and romance. My name is Tila. I'm a sex educator, relationship expert, and published author. People often ask me why I choose to talk about this, why I teach sex ed, and it is because it is my favorite topic. I love helping people connect with and understand their own sexuality, as well as foster healthier and longer lasting relationships. There is so much to learn, and we are breaking new ground all the time in the conversations that are happening and things we are discovering in this field. So, if you have a topic that you would like to hear in a future podcast, please send in your question, and you can send in your questions to questions@exploresextalk.com. So today we are going to talk about the big O, orgasms. An orgasm is the sensation of intense sexual pleasure. It is often considered the climax or peak of sexual activities and is sometimes referred to as coming or climaxing. Historically, it has been called things like the little death, and that sort of ties into the intensity and lack of understanding we had about what happened during an orgasm and the fact that they used to think that orgasms were seizures. Anyway, I digress. Anyone can have an orgasm, if they're in the mood and feeling properly sexually stimulated. At this time, there isn't actually an agreed upon overarching explanation of orgasms. Health experts have actually only recently started looking into the benefits of orgasms in, say, the last 50 years or so, and acknowledging the idea of female orgasm or a vulva orgasm only really started around the 1970s. Historically, it was believed that it was normal for people with vulvas to not really experience an orgasm. We know a lot about the human body, but we don't actually really know as much about orgasms at this point. It's still an area that we're continuing to expand our knowledge. But we have learned a few things, like what, right? We know that an orgasm doesn't just happen. There are actually a few different stages to the changes that happen in our bodies. And there are some different ideas about what these stages are, and it sort of depends on what research model you're looking at. Now, most researchers accept the Master and Johnson 4-phase model. And this model holds that it happens, obviously, in 4 stages. It's called the 4-phase model. But people at first they feel excitement, and then they progress to a small plateau. The orgasm follows the plateau, and then this moves into the resolution stage. There's also another theory by Kaplan, and his theory of orgasms, or the Kaplan model, holds that there are actually 3 stages: desire, excitement, and orgasm. Now, the Kaplan model is actually less commonly accepted because most researchers tend to avoid non-genital changes. In the field, they mostly look at things that can be observed, and usually around the genitals, because that's where most things happen during an orgasm. It's also because desire can be very difficult to predict and definitively observe. Not everyone experiences or shows desires in the same way. It's also really important to note that desire is not always a part of sexual activity. People can experience sexual activity that they have no desire for and still experience a physiological reaction. So our emotional reaction and our physical reaction, therefore, are not always the same united experience. And we see this when we are looking at cases of sexual assault. Sometimes survivors will feel guilty because their body responded, but they had no desire for the actual event. So it creates this conflict because of the idea of, well, if your body responded, you must have enjoyed it. That's not true. I mean, that's sort of getting into areas of consent, and let's talk about rape and sexual assault in another episode, because that's a very large topic. But I just wanted to throw that as a small example of how desire isn't always part of sexual activity, but that doesn't mean that there won't be a physiological reaction because our body reacts to stimuli. Same way it reacts to being cold or hot or tired. If you're presented with stimulus, the body is going to react to that in order to preserve or minimize damage or whatever the case calls for. So let's look a little bit deeper into this physical reaction. There's a lot of things that happen to our bodies during an orgasm, and all of this information is sent to our brains. So when we orgasm, our brain is flooded with dopamine. And dopamine, if you may have heard this term before but not know what it is, it's kind of like the feel-good chemical in our brain. It makes us feel good and creates a desire or craving to have it again. And it's sort of called the reward system in the brain, right? So when we have dopamine in our system, a number of other hormones are also released into the body that contribute to our feelings of pleasure and satisfaction. Research using PET scans has actually found for brain activity during orgasm is actually the same regardless of gender. So it doesn't matter what your gender is, it doesn't matter what genitals you have, your brain activity is going to be the same pretty much as everybody else. That's the same regardless of how the experiences differ or how long the experience goes on. The same sort of stuff is happening in the brain. And the lateral orbit frontal cortex sort of turns off. And that's the part that just sort of lets us let go of reason and control and self-evaluation. It's what creates that feeling of loss of control during an orgasm. It shuts down our anxiety and our fears and just paves the way for just experiencing that pleasure. Now, people with vulvas can also experience a trance-like state that is caused by relaxation in the amygdala and the hippocampus. And for people who have penises, the relaxation in these brain areas reduces feelings of aggression and generally increases the state of tranquility. Now, there isn't much difference in terms of brain activity, but the biggest differences between penis and vulva sort of stem in how the anatomy works. So on average, people with vulvas take about 20 minutes to reach orgasm. Now, it is possible for someone with a vulva to obviously come quicker, but it's very personal and very dependent. That's why it's an average of 20 minutes. And it's also possible for people with vulvas to have multiple orgasms in a row, one right after another. Now, this obviously changes the experience because the feeling of buildup is longer before the first release. And it's been reported that some people don't experience that sense of completeness or finality because their body is actually already ready for the next orgasm to occur. So this can be an advantage, though, because when somebody's properly stimulated, they can just continue to go through waves and waves of pleasure. Now, obviously, people with penises, it's different because they have a much shorter buildup time. On average, it takes about 3 minutes for a penile orgasm. And in most cases, the individual needs a recovery period before they're able to have sex again. And this recovery time obviously ranges from person to person. There's so many different things happening in individual biology that it's hard to predict, and that's why it varies from person to person. But because of this, once a penile orgasm has happened, there's usually a much stronger sense of completion and sexual satisfaction. And they're also likely to experience a higher release of hormones like nitric acid, vasopressin, serotonin, a few other ones, which can actually make it extremely difficult to stay awake, which is, why there's that common thing of guys having an orgasm, then rolling over and falling asleep. It's actually because of all those chemicals not chemicals, but hormones that got released in the brain. Now, we're still studying the health effects of having orgasms, but we have identified several hormones, like I said, that are released during an orgasm. And these hormones cause our muscles to relax and can actually reduce the amount of the stress hormone in our system. So there are some studies that suggest these hormones have a protective quality, and can reduce our chances of cancer. Some research has actually found that the risk for prostate cancer is about 20% lower in people who have ejaculated at least 21 times in a month compared to those who've only ejaculated, say, 4 to 7 times. Now, the research isn't completely conclusive. It's a little correlational right now, which means these things are linked, but not necessarily a causal thing. So a little bit more research needs to be done. Now, with all these hormones swirling around, what does an orgasm actually feel like? It's actually a pretty common question. So if this is a question you've had before and you're not sure how to answer it, don't worry, you are not alone. A lot of people, particularly women, struggle with knowing if they've ever had an orgasm, and many others have a hard time pinpointing when and if their orgasm actually occurred. They know they had fun and they felt really good, but they don't know if it was an orgasm. Media such as, movies and TV and pornography would lead us to believe that all orgasms are these earth-shattering experiences that leave us completely unable to think or move. And while it's true that some orgasms may be that way, not all of them are. And much of what we see in the media is exaggerated for the sake of entertainment. Because orgasms can have a real range of sensations and intensities, and these all depend on a variety of factors. That can be why it can be sort of difficult for people to describe what an orgasm feels like, because there isn't actually one universal answer to that question. It's not the same every time. Like so many other aspects of sexuality, it depends on each individual person. How we process the experience is framed from the collection of experiences we've had so far. What we find thrilling or pleasurable, or even what we think or feel about sex. The answer is further complicated by the fact that no two orgasms are really the same. Now, there are some common things that happen during an orgasm. This can be things like increased breathing or rapid heart rate, squeezing or contraction of muscles. Some people may experience like a reddened face or neck or chest, and that can be called a sex flush. Obviously, body fluids are released. So those are some common things that do happen. But once again, the intensity may be different each time. So this means people can describe them in a variety of ways. So some common descriptions, in case you're wondering, people have said that orgasms can feel like fireworks or explosions or melting, or intense energy, maybe pulsing between the legs, a sensational roller coaster. Some people just feel incredibly warm. Or they may say, they feel electricity surging through their body, or body numbness. I mean, these are just a few things. There's so many different descriptions of what people experience. And, one of the reasons this is so hard to pinpoint is because who really knows what other people are feeling? The reality is that it'll feel a little bit different for everyone, and it's going to feel different at different times, as I mentioned, right? Why does it feel different each time? Why is there this range of differences in orgasm? And the answer to that is actually a little bit complex, because the reality is that there's so many different things that impact our sex drive and our experience of sex. The first and foremost of them is our mindset. How do we feel about sex and our bodies? Are we comfortable in our own skin? Do we have a healthy and active sex life? Are we embarrassed about sex? Do we feel self-conscious when we're with our lover? Do we stop to enjoy what's happening? Are we in our head too much? All of these things can impact our enjoyment of sex and ultimately how we experience an orgasm. Since we're never exactly in the same mindset and mood all the time, this can really influence our experience from one orgasm to the next. Orgasms can also be impacted by our own sexual experiences. So if we're relatively inexperienced, we may not know what we like as much, or maybe our bodies aren't used to that type of stimulation. Even experiences like masturbation can really help increase the intensity and satisfaction of our orgasm. The more types of sexual experiences we have, even if it is just masturbation, helps us really discover what we like. It helps us figure out what really gets us off. And this can actually cut the time we spend looking for what feels good and can contribute to a more satisfying overall experience. Another impact to our pleasure is how connected we feel to our partner and how important that we deem that sense of connection. Some people place a very high value on emotional intimacy and feeling close to your sex partner. So that can really stimulate the level of sexual interest, right? It can actually complement and intensify physical sensations during sex. I mean, after all, sex really is about connection. If we're feeling one with our partner on a mental, emotional, and maybe even a spiritual level, then the physical act of coming together is going to feel a lot more intense than with someone that we don't really share that sense of connection with. Now, not everyone is like that. Not everyone needs that sense of emotional or mental connection in order to feel that intensity as well. So that's just something to know. Our orgasm is also impacted by how well we feel. Are we stressed out, sick? Do we eat reasonably well? Do we feel well? Have we slept well? Are we exhausted? What about dehydrated? How we physically feel plays a large role in our experience. Sex is like any other physical activity. It's healthy exercise, and how much we put into it and get out of it is going to depend on how good we are feeling. So with all these things that can impact our sexual experience, is there anything we can do to try and have a better experience? And the answer is yes, absolutely. So I just want to cover some tips about that because it's a common question that people have is, like how can I get in that zone? How can I have a better orgasm or a more intense orgasm? Or maybe I'm having a hard time getting to an orgasm. How can I do that? So the first thing to remember is that it's really easy to let our heads get in the way of being able to relax. In many cases, this happens when people are trying to orgasm as well. The more pressure we put on it, the harder it becomes. The more we can relax, the easier it becomes. So often our thoughts are on things other than the activities or feelings we're experiencing. So this division in our attention can actually stand in the way of feeling those good sensations and excitement of sex. So one of the ways we can help stay out of our heads is to actually focus on our bodies. So draw your attention to the sensations you're feeling, your breathing. If you find that thoughts are still filling your head, acknowledge them, but just let them go. Try not to dwell on things that aren't contributing to the pleasure of the moment. It's also important not to focus too much on the idea of having an orgasm, but instead focus on the pleasure you're experiencing. Sex is not a performance. So you are not and you should not be performing. Try not to think about those kind of things. Don't compare yourself to what you've seen in porn or what you've seen in that movie that you like or that movie that your partner likes. How you respond to pleasure is unique and it should feel natural. If it feels natural to be loud, then be loud. Feels natural to be quiet, then be quiet. You should not spend your time worrying about how your pleasure appears. Just stay in the moment and enjoy it. Another thing we can do is just make sure that we're comfortable and familiar with our own bodies. Vulva people in particular are not encouraged to explore their own bodies or pleasure and are often shamed when they do. As I sort of mentioned earlier, masturbation can be a great way to sort of learn what you like and what you don't. And taking some time to experiment with self-love can increase your comfort with your own body. Aside from helping you figure out what you like and what you find pleasurable, it can actually strengthen the neurological connections for those nerve endings around your genitalia and other pleasure centers. So in many ways, you're teaching your body to be a little bit more sensitive to sexual stimulation, which for the most part is a good thing. During these times, remember to try and stay out of your head. One of the main advantages of doing this is that you're on your own. There's going to be less pressure for feeling like you need to perform for somebody else. So just take that pace that feels right to you. This can also be a great time to experiment with other things such as new toys. Remember to make the focal point that pleasure. Orgasms are great, but the main goal here is to increase your sexual pleasure. The more you do that, the easier an orgasm will come. When you're with a partner, one of the best tips, of course, as always, comes down to good communication. Once you've had some time to figure out what you do like, it's important that you communicate it. And not just that you communicate it, but how you communicate it makes a difference. No one ever wants to feel like their partner's putting them down or making them feel incompetent. So, how you choose to phrase things can make a big difference. When giving your partner direction, try to avoid saying things like, not like that, or less strong. Could instead phrase things a little bit more positively and say, I prefer this way, or when it's soft like that, it makes me melt. You're giving your partner the same message, but the latter is going to keep your partner from becoming discouraged. And it's also going to guide them a little bit more to what you actually want instead of focusing on what you don't want. Another thing to remember is that sex is made up of all different kinds of sensations. Many couples, particularly heterosexual couples, tend to focus a lot on intercourse. And for a lot of people, this just may not be enough variety of stimulation. So don't be afraid to mix in some foreplay, clitoral stimulation, or other types of activities to keep that pleasure rolling and building. Once again, I know I've said this a couple times already, but it's super important, so I'm going to keep saying it. It's important to remember that pleasure and connection should be the focus of your time. Orgasms are amazing, but focusing too hard on them can make the whole process of sex kind of goal-oriented and even ruin the experience. People feel pressured, they rush, they become focused on feeling like they're checking off boxes rather than really connecting and enjoying the experience. And this can lead to things like faking orgasms. Now, the subject of fake orgasms can be a bit touchy for some people, especially since many people can feel that despite what others say, they never get a straight answer if they ask, or even asking can be upsetting. And that can cause a lot of problems in a relationship. So I just want to take a few minutes to talk about fake orgasms. I know this episode's getting along quite long, but it's important. I just want to sneak it in there. So let's just do it. First off, anyone is capable of faking an orgasm. Anybody. Doesn't matter what your gender is. It doesn't matter what genitals you have. Anyone is capable of faking one. But a big question that people should ask is why? Like, why bother? As I said, anyone is capable of faking an orgasm. However, it is more common for women to admit that they faked an orgasm than people of other genders. This typically stems from the fact that many women are extremely self-conscious during sex, as they have been raised to believe or feel that sex is not really something that they should enjoy. They feel guilty about enjoying it. They often report struggling to orgasm, and this can actually make them feel inadequate, particularly if they watch a lot of porn or if their partners watch a lot of porn. They compare themselves to that, or maybe their partner has said something about past lovers, so they compare themselves to that, and sometimes even to what their friends say they experience. So rather than admit that they're having some trouble getting to orgasm, they will fake it to make it seem like everything's okay. Now, the second major reason people tend to fake is to spare partners' feelings and just sort of move the moment along. So if a person isn't enjoying sex, or maybe they're distracted by something else, or maybe they're just not feeling it, for all those reasons that we sort of talked about earlier, they may just not be able to reach orgasm in that moment. So the temptation can be to just try to get through the moment without disappointing their partner. The rationale being that if they fake an orgasm, their partner will feel better about hitting their climax and ending the activities. Faking an orgasm can actually be a sign of a real communication problem in a relationship. If we're unable to be honest with our partners at one of the most intimate moments we share with them, it can call into question what else we might be being dishonest about. And when the truth comes out, it can actually damage the trust that exists between two people. And it can lead to some further communication difficulties as well. So one partner might feel incredibly hurt by the deception, as it can make them feel foolish or maybe inadequate. And for anyone thinking that they're doing a good job pleasing their partner, it can be pretty devastating to learn otherwise. People in healthy relationships are counting on their partners for honesty and intimacy and safe space. Aside from the potential hurting of someone's feelings, people should not be faking orgasms for one really important reason. Fake orgasms lead to increasingly bad sex and communication. When people fake, they're teaching their partner that what the partner is doing is really working for them when it's not, which means that partner is likely to go back to those same moves because they've been led to believe that it's good and that their partner liked it. And once this has been established by a fake orgasm, it can be a really uncomfortable conversation to say you want something else. So uncomfortable that many people choose not to come clean about their fake orgasm and simply suffer through the same things that aren't really working for them. And over a long enough timeline, when we aren't satisfied by our sexual activities, our interest in them naturally wanes. Sex starts to feel more like a chore than enjoyable time with your partner. And as that lack of honest communication stretches out, it can actually be the beginning of the end for many couples. So at the end of the day, faking an orgasm really isn't worth it. It's better to just be honest with your partner about where you're at and have both of you focus on the pleasure you experience together instead of worrying about that ultimate orgasm goal. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I apologize that it was a bit longer than I usually try and shoot for, but thank you so much for tuning in and sticking it out to the end. Feel free to check out my website, exploresextalk.com, for even more information and tips. And do a little something for this podcast and hit that subscribe button. Like it, share it, spread the word of sexy goodness. We will be back next week with another episode. And until then, have another fantastic week. And as always, stay safe and stay sexy.